Chapter 25. Chapter 22. October passed much in the same way as September, only that now Eliza wore her Slytherin scarf to her outside lessons as the weather grew colder. She kept having to reapply heating charms in the chamber as well. Jormy had been lonely over the summer, and Eliza spent most of her second-day runs in the chamber, curled up within the basilisk's coils. All of her teachers had decided to increase their workload as they approached their owl year. It was tedious, not challenging, and Eliza sometimes wished she could take the owls right now if it meant she didn't have to write simpleton essays on non-verbal spells or Merlin forbid another S on the laws of transfiguration. Her only saving grace was Slytherin's library, where she had taken to delving into the darker books she had been eyeing last year, full of curses and jinxes that even made Eliza wrinkle her nose in disgust, although she was interested in Salazar's notes. He had been writing in a time before magic had been thought of, but there was an interesting experiment on a curse that would accelerate the decaying process. Necromancy was, of course, a forbidden art. Eliza couldn't explain why she was attracted to it so much, but she assumed it was safe enough to read about. No one else would see the chamber, after all, so no one else had to know. It was late October when a sign was pinned in the entrance hall, informing all students that the delegations from Beakspattens and Durmstrang would arrive that Friday with lessons ending half an hour early. Eliza was thankful that Fridays were the one day she didn't actually have to use her time turner. Hogwarts is going to get humiliated, isn't it? Draco drawled as they walked into the common rooms. Yep, Eliza said, popping the P obnoxiously. Are we going to do anything about it? Blaise asked. Nope. It seemed that the Triwizard Tournament was the only thing the school could talk about. Even the professors seemed to be tenser as the day of everyone's arrival grew nearer. Eliza didn't think she'd ever seen the armor sparkle so brightly before now. Liza could honestly say she couldn't care less about the stupid tournament. She supposed it would be funny to see some poor half-wit get stuck in a literal death trap of a competition, but that was about all the entertainment she could see herself getting from the whole charade. Except perhaps meeting some Durmstrang students. They were bound to have some interesting thoughts on dark magic. The only one of them who seemed to be excited about the tournament was Draco because Victor Crumb Eliza. Here, at Hogwarts. And it was that exact thing he rambled on about as they stood outside in the cold waiting to welcome the different schools. Eliza shivered and huddled closer into her scarf, glaring at nothing and everything as she waited to go back inside. I don't see anything, Eliza grumbled as she shifted in annoyance. Of course you can't. You're too small, Blaise quipped, now the tallest of all of them resting his arm on the top of Eliza's head. I will murder you, Eliza said lightly, but Blaise merely responded with a soft laugh. I know, he whispered, not wanting to speak too loud unless they wanted to attract Professor Snape and his intimidating glare. It was 5 minutes later when the Beauxbaton students arrived. A giant blue carriage landed in front of them, making the earth quake as it landed, giant winged Palomino horses trotting to a halt as they pulled the carriage behind them. Eliza regarded the Beauxbaton students curiously as they huddled together and watched keenly as Madame Maxime, she simply had to have some giant blood in her, chatted avidly with Dumbledore. She couldn't really see anyone of interest in the crowd. If they were that put off by the weather, then Eliza couldn't imagine any of them doing that well in the competition. The Beauxbaton students shuffled away into the castle, leaving Hogwarts to wait in the cold to meet Durmstrang. It was another tedious 10 minutes later in which her court had taken turns in trying to jinx Theosark's neon color that they arrived. The ship rose out of the lake. It cut a skeletal figure as it glided across the black lake approaching the banking, and with a great splash threw a plank down so the Durmstrang students, led by the headmaster, could finally reach them. Karkaroff was a known Death Eater, and so Eliza watched curiously as he and Dumbledore spoke. Finding their conversation lacking, Eliza turned her gaze onto the students. She immediately spotted Crumb, standing near the headmaster's side grumpily, but none of the other students truly stood out. She scanned the rows, quickly trying to spot anyone of interest, when she practically stumbled back in shock, because there stood someone she had never expected to see. He stood at the end of the row, and she could practically see the smugness falling off him in the quirk of his lip, and the straightness of his spine, the slight tilt of his chin. His hair was no longer as dark as it was, but was still a thick dark brown, neatly styled, stray curls falling across his face, and into his eyes, which she knew would be the deep molten brown instead of crimson red. Tom. She was surprised her voice didn't waver, surprised he even heard her when she was so sure she wouldn't even be able to breathe the word. Pushing her way through the small crowd of Slytherins, she stopped at the front of her house. He smiled sharply at her, a large, crooked grin as his warm eyes lit up. "Little star," he greeted, and Eliza felt happiness fill her when her nickname fell from his lips. "Tom," she said delightedly in response, half laugh, half exclamation, and sprang forward until she slammed into him. He immediately wrapped his arms around her, and Eliza practically melted. This wasn't just a Horcrux, one part of a whole. This was Tom, her Tom. "My little star," he said, fondness dripping from his words as he rested his head on top of her own. "I'm not that little now," she countered petulantly, and felt a smug grin cross her face when he let out a small laugh. The pair of them simply stood staring, drinking in the sight of one another. It was a strange feeling, being reunited with a piece of your soul. It wasn't until a professor cleared their throats from behind them did they jolt out of their reminiscing. Eliza refused to do something as plebeian as blush, but by the teasing grin Tom had on his face, he knew she was trying to hide her embarrassment anyway. "I believe," Snape said haltingly, looking somewhat traumatized as he continued to look at Eliza, "and Tom, we should all adjourn to the great hall for the feast." "Of course, Professor." Eliza chirped merrily, dragging Tom behind her as she headed towards her court. As the crowd of students began to move, Eliza took a chance to look at Dumbledore. The old man was shockingly pale, gripping his wand tightly as his blue eyes never left Tom's form next to her. She could understand why Severus was shocked. She had a very close set of friends, and she had only just started to be more open with them instead of shying away from their touches. She suspected Dumbledore was pale for a whole different Dark Lord-shaped reason. "Shame he didn't have a heart attack," Eliza muttered to Tom as they headed for the Great Hall. "It certainly would have saved me the job," came his dry reply, and Eliza had to muffle a snort. When they reached the Great Hall, her court were already sat down, speaking quietly, but they stop when Eliza approaches. Sliding into her own seat, Eliza turned to look at Draco, who was sat beside her. Poking him in the ribs, she told him to move over, too distracted by Crumb being sat at their table to even make a token protest. He shuffled over without complaint. Tom took his place to her right, Theo remaining at her left. The look Tom was giving her told her he knew exactly what she was doing, but the self-satisfied smile told her he was enjoying it even more. "Everyone, this is Tom, Thomas Gaunt," he interrupted smoothly, flashing everyone a charming grin, and even though as Slytherins they should have known better, she could see each one of her court be pulled in by his charisma. "It's a pleasure to finally put faces to names. Little Star speaks of you all often," he continued, quirking an eyebrow at Eliza when she turned a vicious glare on him. "Is this your bow, Eliza?" Daphne asks, finally putting the pieces together, and Eliza almost choked on nothing at all. Sensing blood in the water, Tom turned to look at her, a predatory grin growing on his face as his eyes flashed with amusement. "Am I your bow now, Eliza?" he asked, a smirk pulling at his lips. "Well, what else was I supposed to call you?" Eliza said airily. "My lord." Tom's eyes darkened at that, and Eliza quickly looked away, thanking the impeccable timing of the house elves as the feast appeared on the table. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" Eliza asked, trying far too hard to sound casual. The silence of her court was stifling, and Eliza knew Tom's presence at Hogwarts couldn't mean anything good for her. Tom Riddle was an omen in his own right, and Eliza knew she and her court were right to be wary. The bastard had the gall to smirk at her, eyes lit up with glee. "I didn't want to ruin the surprise, darling. I have gifted my presence onto you after all," Eliza snorted. It was easy to see how the other Horcruxes had influenced him now. It seemed Tom only grew into his incorrigible flirtatious habits. "You might have pretty packaging, Gaunt, but inside you're nothing but a nuisance," Eliza quipped. Merlin, the new second name, would take some getting used to. Tom didn't let up. Instead, his eyes widened as he leaned forward, conspiringly placing a hand against his heart. "My little star, you think I'm pretty?" he purred, batting his eyelashes exaggeratedly. Eliza huffed, shoving his face away. "Pretty annoying, yeah. Tom dropped all pretenses, letting out a soft snicker as he finally leant back. He propped his head onto his hand as he observed her court coolly. "I must thank you for looking after Eliza these years. She has a way of getting herself into trouble. We'd do anything to protect Eliza. From anyone," Daphne responded in kind, not moving her gaze from Tom's. Sensing the rising tensions, Eliza desperately tried to change the subject to avoid a duel actually starting in the Great Hall. "Aren't you worried Dumbledore will recognize you?" Eliza asked curiously, and Tom broke his staring contest with Daphne to look at Eliza. "Not to fear, little star. Thomas Gaunt is a bastard child of the last remaining of the line. He never met his father and his mother, an unknown half-blood, died in her effort to move him out of England so he would never be discovered. Karkaroff knows of my origins and happily took me in as a ward of Durmstrang," Tom explained with a smirk pulling at his lips. "Official records?" Theo asked curiously. "As if I would allow subpar forgeries," Tom said airily, and Eliza snorted at his tone. Even Theo cracked a smile. "Now tell me what you've been up to, little star. I have missed your letters." Tom spoke, turning so he was directly facing her. Eliza immediately leaped into the conversation, speaking about Hagrid's blast-ended Scroots and her, and Draco's numerous plots to kill them. She spoke of Severus, planned to poison one of them to check if their antidotes worked, which made Tom laugh. He in turn told her about how much fun he had terrorizing the students of Durmstrang, who had no idea who was actually walking amongst them. His eyes lit up as he explained the various duels he had won, and Eliza listened indulgently. Eliza allowed the easy conversation to wash over and ignored how Tom had yet to tell her why he was actually here. Some say ignorance was bliss, but Eliza knew better. She could see the beginnings of war, and she was scared that Tom had brought it right to her doorstep. She would find out tomorrow, Eliza decided, as she watched Tom break the ice with her court. She would at least have tonight without any worries plaguing them. What was the worst that could happen? Eliza hated how much that sounded like she was tempting fate. When she woke up the next morning, it was to a harsh game of 20 questions. She had barely stepped into the common room before her court converged around her. "What is he doing here?" Daphne demanded, eyes flashing with anger. Eliza was taken aback by her vehemence. Sure, they tended to avoid the topic of Tom like the plague, but they had at least seemed amenable to their alliance last year. "I don't know," Eliza said simply, swinging her bag over her shoulder. "Why hasn't he told you?" It was Blaise this time, his arms crossed as he stood behind Daphne. "I don't know." "What do you mean you don't know?" Draco asked incredulously, and Eliza rolled her eyes. "I'm not his keeper, just his Horcrux," Draco spluttered indignantly, and Eliza sighed. Spinning around and pinching the bridge of her nose, she tried to temper her rising anger. "We might have a vow. Tom might even consider me something of a friend, as much as someone like him can feel something like that for anyone. But it will do you well to remember he is a Dark Lord," Eliza emphasizes, glaring at Daphne, Draco, and Blaise as Theo stood quietly beside her. "He tolerates you because I care for you, but I do not control him. I'm going to try and find out why he's here today, and if I deem it fit to tell you, I will, if you deem it fit," Blaise said scornfully. "Who am I, Blaise?" Eliza said sharply, glaring at him. Blaise went quiet, staring at the ground. "You are all my friends, but you will not forget your place. I would have hoped you would all deal with this maturely, but I appear to be mistaken," Eliza said severely, and tried to ignore the pang of hurt that followed their reactions. She had hoped nothing would change between them. She should have known things had been going to well for her lately. "Until you stop acting like children, I must ask you to leave me alone today, as I will most likely be with Tom," Eliza ordered clearly, and then turned her back on her court. "Goodbye." She began walking and looked in surprise as Theo fell into step beside her. "They'll come around, you know. They just don't get these things," he commented softly, and Eliza sighed. Theo was right, as usual. Daphne and Draco had been shielded from the war, and even though Draco had outgrown many of his childish tendencies, still remained. And even though he didn't shy away from dark magic, he was still blind to the realities. And he probably hated the fact that Eliza's attention was going to be even more split between them now. And Blaise expected to be trusted. He and Theo had known her the longest. It probably pained him to know Eliza was still keeping things from them, but it was what she had to do. Theo linked his arm through Eliza's. Let's get some strawberries, and then we can watch people submit their names into the goblet, Theo said kindly. And then we can track down that dark lord of yours. Eliza laughed softly at that as they strode through the great hall doors. He's not my dark lord, Eliza protested as they gathered some breakfast food, placing it into a conjured basket. Well, he's certainly not mine, Theo quipped, and Eliza burst into ringing laughter. Come hell or high water, she would always have Theo not. She and Thea settled into an alcove in the entrance hall, watching the goblet curiously as they ate breakfast and made fun of the prospective champions. Theo almost choked on his croissant when the Weasley twins attempted to get over the age line. Eliza took another sip of her coffee. Sirius had bought her a refilling flask over the holidays after learning of her addiction. She watched as Cedric Diggory put his name in and clapped idly with the rest of the students gathered in the entrance hall. Hello, little star. Fuck. Eliza cursed, jumping in surprise, and turned to glare at Tom. Such language. How rude of you, Eliza, he tutted, a small smirk pulling at his lips. It's rude to sneak up on people, Eliza grumbled. No one ever snuck up on her. Tom, as always, seemed to be the exception to the rule. Are you putting your name in Gaunt? Theo asked, subtly cringing at using Tom's last name. Why, of course. It's an honor to represent my school, Tom said fastidiously. If Eliza didn't know better, she might have even believed him. He would be a great politician. And after that, we need to talk, Eliza said, seriously meeting his eyes. Tom quirked an eyebrow as he studied her, as if he had never seen her before he nodded, acquiescing. Tom pulled a slip of parchment out of his pocket before he strode across the hall towards the goblet. Many people were discussing the mysterious Durmstrang student who knew Eliza anyway, but Tom attracted stares all by himself. He walked elegantly, with a presence larger than life. And of course, he was undeniably handsome. That paired with his charm, even if Eliza knew it was false, made it easy to see how he had all of Hogwarts eating out of his palm all those years. Dropping his name into the goblet with a satisfied smile, Tom turned to look at Eliza. Are you giving me a tour then, little star? He asked, pitching his voice so it carried across the hall. Rolling her eyes fondly at his dramatics, she turned to look at Theo, who beckoned her to go with Tom. Just be careful, Eliza, he said, worry clear on his face, and Eliza smiled softly as she stood up. Aren't I always? Eliza led Tom to the room of requirement in uncomfortable silence. Is it strange? Eliza asked, in hopes of breaking the strange silence that had settled upon them, being back at Hogwarts. In a way, Tom responded, looking pensive. Of course, I hadn't been at Hogwarts for 20 years when I made the diadem. I have nostalgic memories of this place. I, however, haunted its halls for 50 years. It makes for some rather mixed feelings. The silence descended on them again when they reached the 7th floor. Eliza had had an easy rapport with each of the Horcruxes. Outside of their first meetings, there had never truly been any tension between them. But now that Tom was real, and here, and not just some figment of her mind or a piece of his soul, Eliza suddenly had no idea how to act around him. She could only hope it would change soon. Reaching the tapestry that marked the spot of the room of requirement, Eliza paced back and forth 3 times before the door appeared. After you, m'lady, Tom joked, holding the door out for her. Why, thank you, my lord, Eliza quipped back and walked into the room. It was a curious amalgamation. It was styled a bit like the Slytherin common room. The fireplace was the one from Grimmauld, but all the furniture was from the apartment Tom had stayed in when he graduated Hogwarts. There was even the record player she had learnt how to swing dance to in the corner of the room. Tom brushed past her, observing the room, and blinked in surprise at the clearly familiar pieces of furniture before turning to talk about. Now, what did you want to speak about, Eliza? Tom asked in a blasé tone, regarding the bookcases that lined the room curiously. Eliza narrowed her eyes. I think you know full well what I want to speak about, Eliza said confrontationally, and watched as Tom's eyebrows tried to climb into his hairline as he pulled an innocently confused face. Sighing, Eliza decided not to beat around the bush. Why are you here? Perhaps I missed you, Tom suggested, running a hand down the side of a book, examining it. Eliza's heart clenched, but she ignored it and snorted sardonically. And how about the truth this time? She said acidly, and Tom's head snapped towards her. I'd remember who you're talking to, darling, he said lightly, dangerously, stalking towards her. I think you best remember, too, Eliza bit back, refusing to move as he invaded her space. You are a child, Tom said, and Eliza bristled angrily. If there was one thing she hated more than anything, it was being treated like a child. Think again, Eliza said sharply, and then Viper quick pressed her wand to Tom's stomach. In the same breath, Tom had also brandished his wand, pointing it beneath her chin. I've killed people for less than that, he murmured, hazel eyes flashing ruby red for one startling moment. Unbreakable vow, remember, Eliza said lowly, jabbing her wand harshly into his stomach. This wasn't her Tom, she realized belatedly. Her Tom didn't exist anymore. This was just Tom, the real Tom. Tom who was dangerous and violent, sure of his place in the world which was above everyone in it. This was a Tom without his teenage thoughts clouding his brain, who was less restless and angry. This was the Tom who was the Dark Lord, and yet he still smiled the same, tilted his head in the same manner. This was the Tom that comforted her, confronted her, challenged her, and made her grow. And Eliza had changed as well from when they had last met. She had learned how to kill and how to love. She was more sure of herself, more confident in her movements and her words. She didn't blindly look up to the boy now, who had only been a few years older than her with such a commanding presence. They shared a soul. They were equal. Obviously, things were new now that they had both changed. But just because change was inevitable didn't mean it had to be their breaking point. Tom must have considered the same thing because he removed his wand at the same moment she herself stepped back. I apologize, Eliza, Tom said slowly, running a hand through his hair. Everything is still so new. Eliza suggested different, confusing. All of the above, Tom breathed, and then threw himself back on the sofa, bringing his long legs up to rest on the cushions. It's okay, Eliza said, because it was really, you're a Dark Lord. I don't expect basic courtesy from you. She quipped and took a seat on the armchair opposite him. Tom chuckled lowly at that and turned his head to face her. That seemed to alleviate the tension between them, and Eliza nestled herself deeper into her armchair, throwing her legs over the side. So why are you here? She asked once more, and this time Tom actually responded, falling into their easy, familiar rhythm. I now hold the majority of my Tom Riddle's soul. Voldemort is now nothing but a shadow of my former self. I can never be truly whole until we reassimilate, and I refuse to be my own enemy. Tom paused here, a pained look coming across his face. But I can't do that without knowing where he is. You lost Voldemort. Shut up. Tom cut off, sounding almost flustered. He has plans to use you to resurrect himself. Eliza balked at that, but Tom continued. It was easy to convince Karkaroff to let me here for the Triwizard tournament. Now all that's left is to wait until Voldemort enacts his plans, and I will be there. The silence lasted a moment before you're using me as bait. Eliza exclaimed incredulously, leaping to her feet, and Tom instantly bolted up when she approached. She hoped she looked as murderous as she felt. Eliza, listen. You know this is a good plan, Tom said, appealing to her logic. There is nothing Voldemort wants more right now than you, and there is nothing I want more right now than Voldemort. He walked closer to her, taking her hands into his large, warm ones, looking down at her earnestly. One last favor, Eliza, and then you'll be free. I'll never be free of you, Tom Riddle. Instead, she simply says, okay. That night 4 names are pulled out of the goblet. Fleur de Lacre of Buxbattens, Cedric Diggory of Hogwarts, Thomas Gaunt of Durmstrang, and Eliza Potter, who can't help but feel like she's a tragedy in the making.